So I'm very sympathetic to there being benefits to running in a Democratic primary. I'm sympathetic to the idea of having someone, as you described Bernie doing in 2016, to draw those strong contrasts between what they represent and what the Democratic Party represents, what the Democratic Party should, in their view, represent, and what it in fact does represent, or what an alternative third party could be versus the corporate Democratic Party. That being said, unlike 2016 or even 2020, the Democratic Party has made it very clear that there won't, in fact, be a primary, that there will not be any debates. The media is participating, the mainstream media is participating in this, largely not acknowledging the candidacies of Marianne Williamson. Increasingly, they are forced to acknowledge the candidacy of RFK Jr. because of his popularity, polling at 20%, getting a lot of attention from independent voters and independent media, a lot of, frankly, conservative leaning media that has a very large platform. And so you're getting a bit of a vibe of a primary from him. But as you point out in your article, you don't see him as carrying the baton of progressive interest or left interest, so that to the extent that he is able to draw certain kinds of contrast, it's not fully representing what Bernie was able to get across, right? It's not advancing Medicare for all. It's not advancing living wage. It's not advancing universal housing or healthcare or anything like that. So I go back to my original point. Mm-hmm. There isn't really a primary for someone to run in and draw a contrast. So what do you do with that? Do you really think that Cornel West wouldn't similarly be ignored? And do you think there's some value in him being able, because of the spoiler threat, to attract attention, even if it is negative attention?
Yeah, I think that Cornel West, if he was running in a Democratic primary, and in part the article was written right around the time of his announcement. It was written for print, so it's somewhat delayed, and it was just updated to replace People's Party with Green Party. So obviously, as you get further along in the process, it becomes harder to make that impact because the primaries are approaching relatively soon, and it's harder to build that kind of pressure on the Democratic Party establishment. But I think as a propaganda point, the main demand that would be made is to have a debate and have Cornel West articulate socialist views. And I think that in itself could become, or would have became a big news story, the shutting out of Cornel West and of a democratic socialist views from the DNC. By the DNC from the debate process. And that would draw, again, a hard contrast between democratic socialists as a opposition and the Democratic Party establishment as being against it. So even that in and of itself, I think, would be useful. Now, what's happening to RFK, I think, is pretty similar to what would happen to Cornel West. And I truly believe that Cornel West could poll something in the range at a minimum of what RFK Jr. is polling. But it does become very hard to bring up the point of principle with RFK Jr. I've been doing it with Marianne Williamson, she's actually a progressive candidate, in part because a lot of his views are very eclectic ideologically. I think he's been associated with some projects and crusades that I personally disagree with quite vehemently. In particular, I mean, I don't want to make this a nuclear power debate, but he was the leading force next to Governor Cuomo dismantling Indian Point in New York, and there's been a host of other issues where
dismantling what was that?
At the Indian Point nuclear power plant in New York, which made power in downstate New York much dirtier, and also got rid of a lot of great union jobs, hurt the town of Buchanan and surrounding areas. And there's a host of issues that should be of concern for socialists that naturally RFK Jr. is not a great representative of. So it would be great if we could use someone like Cornel West with his popularity, with his ability to reach people beyond the existing left. And we could use that as the rallying cry to criticize the DNC's approach to this election cycle.
So I am not I would not have chosen some of the fights that RFK Jr. Has chosen. But I also have to acknowledge that the fact of him picking up the mantle of people who felt railroaded, undermined, ignored, attacked in the context of the COVID pandemic because they were oppositional to mandates from a civil libertarian perspective, because they felt lied to by misrepresentations from the CDC, whether or not you think they were made in good faith or just were mistakes that they had to do course corrections as new evidence came out about whether or not the vaccines were going to be able to stop transmissibility the way that was initially promised, the back and forth pivots on masking and et cetera. His choice to focus on those things is part of what his popularity is linked to. And so I have some skepticism that Cornel West, were he to run in the Democratic primary, would attract the same amount of attention or poll numbers as RFK Jr. The same way that Marianne Williamson, despite doing, frankly, a lot better than I think a lot of people expected and much better than she did last time she was running, is at 9-ish% to RFK Jr.'s 20-ish%. I think that he's really captured where the energy is, like it or not, among political independents, both left and right, and that is anti-war sentiment, being very critical of America's role in the war between Ukraine and Russia, being very pointed and direct about wanting to cut the military budget and end U.S. interventionism, and also having a focus on these kind of free speech, civil libertarian issues that many folks argue the left used to lead on, but does not any longer. When it comes to free speech on the internet, I know we could caveat a lot of that, and there's a lot of bad faith arguments made there. But generally speaking, he's seen as someone who is principled on those kinds of free speech issues and also the civil libertarian aspects of the COVID pandemic. That being said, so go ahead.
No, I was going to say that I actually have more faith, I guess, that Cornel West would be able to have a hearing and also shift the conversation a little, in that the sense that, one, on anti-war issues and on defense, he's just as credible as RFK Jr. He's been criticizing U.S. expansionism and the role it plays in the world, and also the blowback to all these actions we're seeing so many places around the world. And also, I think he would be able to foreground issues like a living wage, like union rights, like Medicare for all, in even more of a forceful way than Williamson and others have been able to. And again, I think his self-identification as democratic socialist is important if we think that a conception of the world that goes beyond kind of a milquetoast progressivism and into a worldview that foregrounds the interests of the working class and its need for self-organization to achieve any gains, even if it takes 5, 10, 15, 20 years to establish the sort of mass independent force that we need to change the country. I think that it would be better served. I think part of, like, I'm on some of the civil libertarian issues, like the question of mandates for workers, like the question of my view of like internet censorship is that it should be roughly regulated as much as you could regulate, regulated so that First Amendment protected activity is protected. So unless you're doing hate speech or direct incitement, I think it should be allowed. So I'm on the same page as many of those people, as many of the people behind RFK Jr. on those terms. I just am much more concerned about these issues of economic redistribution and the hardship facing
I totally get that,
families.
And I frankly agree that I frankly agree that Cornel West would be as good, frankly better than RFK Jr. on the foreign policy points. I do think that there has to be some acknowledgement that RFK Jr. has built this audience partly because of being a leading high-profile voice in defense of kind of COVID skepticism throughout COVID. That's the only point that I'm trying to make here.
I definitely agree. Yeah.
And also the point, the fact of the Democratic Party refusing to have a primary means that some of these points you make in the article about how, West's moral clarity on the debate stage would be so meaningful are moot. There is no debate stage. And that gets to this core issue that I think a lot of critics of your perspective here have, which is that the Democratic Party, through those two Bernie campaigns, demonstrated its unwillingness to be even a little bit fair. People reference the statements, the arguments that were made in the context of the DNC lawsuit, where they said, we don't have to have a fair primary. You don't have to, there's no guarantee that the money that you're donating to a candidate like Bernie Sanders is going to, be able to facilitate him having any kind of legitimate run here, that we're able to rig the primary, that we're able to coordinate whoever we want. This is a corporation. This is a private institution. And that being the case, because Bernie Sanders was in some ways the platonic ideal of a progressive candidate, and we saw what happened to him 2 times around. And moreover, the things that were in his control outside of the rigging of the primary, his choice to shut down the movement effort at the end of the day and not want to do a dirty break or not tell people that they needed to resist the Democratic Party. To me, that was the moment where he could have raised some of the most stark contrasts. The moment he could have told the American public, there is no democracy within the Democratic Party. This is not a fair system. And you should not bend the knee and vote for the anointed candidate if you want there to ever be anything that vaguely appears to be democracy in this nominating process. He could have taken that moment to say, if the Democratic Party wants to not lose to the Republicans, if you're concerned about not electing someone like Donald Trump for the first or second time, then you have to have a fair process. And it's not my job to bend the knee to you. It's your job to have legitimacy so that I can actually, in good faith, tell my followers that they should continue to contribute to and believe in this system. And so the fundamental question I guess I have is, are you concerned about what it means for someone to run in the Democratic Party and validate tacitly or explicitly the party that I think we both understand to be both corporatized and corrupt?
Well, I think Bernie Sanders in practice did change a lot of American politics in his 2 runs. He established that there was a left opposition to the establishment. He associated us with some key issues like Medicare for all, like a expanded minimum wage, like unionization, like a more progressive foreign policy. That Henry Kissinger moment during the debate that I mentioned before. I mean, that really I think was part of this message that we're different than the rest. The DNC, I think, was unable to stop him from getting those messages out, was unable to stop him from getting second in both races. Obviously, Obama's intervention plus the DNC was a decisive factor in 2020. And I think that I'm sympathetic, though, to the Sanders perspective of I'm going to choose who to be in opposition to. That's the first part of his perspective that I am sympathetic to. So in other words, I would rather be in opposition to a center-right Democratic party government than a far-right Republican government. That part I'm sympathetic to. I think the problem is Sanders has not always actually been a clear oppositional force once that government came into office. So in 2020 to now, I think Sanders has really seen himself as being the junior partner in a coalition with Biden and trying to smuggle in left-wing policy goals through the Biden administration. I think the squad has conceived themselves there. So Sanders was there to say, we need this stimulus, we need this infrastructure bill to be $5 billion, whereas Biden wanted $2 billion, and the conservative Democrats wanted less than $1 billion. And he saw his role in that way. And I think a lot of that has backfired to the extent that I don't think the left today is as visible and as strong and as distinct of a oppositional force as it was in the past. But to me, that's the mistake that happened after the November 2020 vote. The idea of us on the socialist left being in opposition to a Biden administration as opposed to being in opposition to a second Trump term, I think was fine. The problem is the socialist left, at least the Bernie Sanders kind of leadership of the left, has not actually been in clear opposition to Biden. I'm not sure if that distinction makes sense.
I mean, I think that's obviously true, but this is the problem. I think critics like Chris Hedges and Cornel West and Shama Sawant point out that, one, there is something that is intrinsically getting a seat at the table has the effect, psychologically, culturally, whatever is going on, of making people less adversarial. It was great that Bernie Sanders said Henry Kissinger isn't my friend, but then he turned around and said Biden is my friend. Biden is a good guy. And he said that on the debate stage when he was supposed to be in a literal competition with Joe Biden. You know, as I think that was like the March 15th debate, COVID, the pandemic is blossoming before our eyes. There has never been a moment where it was more important to be a champion and talk about the stakes of something like having a candidate that is advocating strongly for Medicare for all versus a candidate who says he would literally veto the thing if it came across his desk and passed Congress. And yet that was the choice that he made. And it's moments like that, with all the faith and confidence that we had with Bernie and him being this platonic ideal of a candidate, at the end of the day, if a Bernie Sanders working within the Democratic Party is going to have that approach. If he's going to say, well, these guys are my friends and I've been in Congress with them all this time and I can work across the table with them and yada, yada, yada. Isn't there something essentially flawed about running within the Democratic Party? Now, I happen to think it's not necessary. I think it is possible for someone to maintain their integrity and maintain their focus and have that adversarial relationship. But undoubtedly, I think time weakens that resolve. And there is something that is blurry in the eyes of the public for someone to position themselves as within a party at the same time they're trying to fundamentally kill it, radically change it in a way that it is unrecognizable, frankly. And when Democrats say, well, you're not a Democrat, oh, you're doing some kind of entryism, oh, you shouldn't be trusted. Well, they're not wrong, right? And I think it does confuse the message to say, I'm running as a Democrat, but I still feel like there are these fundamental flaws that justify my run, but also I'm willing to fight with one arm behind my back because I have to make nice, appeal to this constituency of Democratic voters that have confidence and faith in the Democratic Party. And I don't want to offend them. So I'm not really being as antagonistic as I maybe could be. And I have these colleagues and these personal relationships. I mean, do you see why many people appreciate the clarity of someone like Cornel West saying, no, I'm not a Democrat. I don't want to run as a Democrat. And I'm going to tell you why you shouldn't invest your energy and resources into that whole project. You should be investing your energy and resources into a party that actually represents your interests.
So I think there's two parts of that. The first part is Bernie Sanders, I think, has a different project than the project that I espouse. In the sense that Bernie Sanders was trying to take office and implement certain reforms, but those reforms didn't necessarily require, in his mind, a total dismantling of the Democratic Party. He hoped to be able to be the left wing of some coalition that he could wield to win valuable reforms for workers, even if it was just by
I think you're right. He did think that, and then look what happens.
Yeah, no. So I think that was one thing. I mean, I do also think that when he said that about Joe Biden being his friend, I personally interpreted it as just like tactically which is a mistaken tactic, but him basically trying to say, listen, you don't have to worry about me. I'm challenging the establishment, but I've been a veteran politician, which was a mistake because it's the opposite of what he should have done, because his whole thing in 2016 was I'm the outsider. The title of his first book, which is a great book, everyone should read it, was, outsider in the House, him about his experience entering Congress and being this odd duck because he actually cared about working people. So totally that was a mistake. But let's think about the thought experiment of, all right, the Democratic Party in itself, in my mind, is something that is more diffuse than your average party. in the world context. The DNC has power, but it does not have the type of power that basically any other party in the world has, and that the Democratic Party is not a membership party. I registered as a Democrat because I lived in New York, and that was the only way to engage in competitive elections on roughly my 18th birthday. When I got my driver's license, you kind of in New York, you register to vote right there. So I registered as a Democrat. I since spent the last 15 plus years of my life advocating against the Democratic Party. Sometimes in more strident terms than others, but over the course of that, 15 years, I was on the socialist left. There was nothing the Democratic Party could do to expel me. So it is kind of unique in that respect. And I think people do understand how loose the party structure is. They do understand when a Trump runs the Republican Party, but is attacking the Republican establishment, he's really running as Trump. He's not running to reclaim or change the Republican Party. So I do think that a socialist could run without it being considered entryism, because there's nothing to enter. It's closer to a zero-party system than a two-party system in that respect. But then also, if you follow the thought experiment of why is the Democratic Party so much worse than, let's say, the Green Party? Well, it's because it's under the influence, obviously, of corporate money and corporate power, and also because it, as a capitalist party, is governing a capitalist state. So a capitalist state needs tax revenue. It needs money to exist, to maintain itself, to bring in fund its programs, from the decent ones like food stamps and Medicaid to the really awful ones like ICBMs and whatever awful things the U.S. government is doing around the world. So in order to do that, you need corporations that in a capitalist society create jobs and sources of revenue and taxation and whatever else. Now, what would happen if the Green Party, with a program that's not a revolutionary program, but is fundamentally a reformist program, got to a point where somehow it became the first or second party in America, was able to form a government? Would it not succumb to those same pressures? Would it not become like the Green parties in Europe, in most cases, worse than their center-left alternatives? Like in places like Germany, where the Green Party was this left-wing alternative to the Social Democrats, and is now probably to the right of the Social Democrats.
But Bhaskar, it strikes, there seems to be a little bit of an inconsistency here for me. Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.